from person to person or from place to place. They're sort of deep things where we care about, wealth and love and, things like that, and not the details of what any culture or time might want. And we derive those from psychology, sociology, or biology, but not internally from economics as much. All constraints are viewed or interpreted as prices. Technology is what creates those constraints. Technology, information, and market settings help create these constraints. And this is often where the laws of hard science enter into economic analysis, and we'll actually see that happening a bunch of times in the course. It tells us the shape of technology and how it interacts with people's preferences, which we derive from these quote-unquote softer sciences. And the fifth thing is that economics, especially price theory, which is going to be the sort of approach we take in this course, focus on the behavior of people in the aggregate rather than individually. It takes a sort of thermodynamic approach rather than a quantum physics approach. It wants to think about how we can predict the behavior of large masses of people on average rather than individual people in any particular situation. And to the extent possible, economists try to avoid talking about things like shifts in preferences, luck, or people's confusion, because they want to, that's just not the language in which economics is natural at expressing things. It wants to express things as these teleological, goal-oriented processes. Now, I don't think that this is the only approach or the best approach that you can take to thinking about social problems, but I think that you'll find during the course that it's a useful discipline on your thinking, and it's a powerful baseline for thinking about many problems, and provides a fruitful language for analyzing many questions, even things that don't seem directly economic. And that's what Becker really tries to emphasize in his piece. He talks about a couple of topics that you wouldn't usually talk about in an economic way, and tries to show how the language of economics is useful for thinking about those. So does anyone remember what Becker says about health? Vrushank, yeah.
He pretty much says like all deaths are pretty much suicides because people rationally choose to smoke and do various activities that are hazardous to them because the marginal value of like increasing 1 year of their health is less than the marginal value of whatever else they're doing, whether they be working or working.
So he's very critical of the notion that that anyone sort of dies completely without their choice. That every choice we make is constantly trading off health against other things. This idea that health is a sacred, separate thing that we would never endanger for something else is sort of absurd. And that, in fact, all sorts of things that we would expect to impact how long someone lives do that not just because of things that happen externally to them, but because of the choices that those types of people will make. And therefore, it's useful thinking about people's choice in determining how much health they end up having, and viewing it as a choice variable rather than viewing it as something that just happens to people. What does Becker say about marriage? Eureka? How do I pronounce your name? Eureka.
Sorry, I dropped this class and I'm just considering taking it now, so I didn't do the reading.
Okay, that's fine. Does anyone else want to talk about Becker's theory about marriage? Come on, you guys must have heard him say this a zillion times last year if you're graduate students. Okay, well, he says that people choose to marry or divorce for economic reasons, right? And they participate in a competitive market, looking for the best spouse they can get, subject to the spouse, the people that are interested in them. And therefore, you would expect people to get into marriages to sort positively on things where there's complementarity. So like you'd expect to marry someone else who also has a high education if you're highly educated, because we think that, people like to be around people who they can, have conversations with and so forth. But you would expect there to be negative assortative matching on things like wages, conditional on these other things, because you have declining marginal utility of wealth, and so it's better to get someone who's really well educated and maybe attractive but doesn't earn that much if you're someone who's earning a lot of money or inherited a lot of money. The final thing that he talks about, and that I'm a big fan of, is that, you know, we're all economists. We all think about these ideas, and we think, you know, that these are just generated based on abstract principles. But he says that academic ideas really do respond to incentives a lot. And let me try to give you an example of that. So I don't know how many of you guys are doing finance as a field, but if you're doing finance as a field, you'll notice that about 1%, probably significantly less than that, of finance papers have anything to do with social welfare or policy in any way. They're almost all about like, quote unquote, informational efficiency. Now, informational efficiency is not efficiency in any other standard economic way of thinking about it. All it means is that there's no way for me to go into the market as a speculator and make a boatload of money. So, you know, even the language of that whole area is defined around how to make money as a speculator, right? On the other hand, if any of you guys are taking IO, IO is all about like, is this particular practice beneficial or harmful to consumers, right? Now, perhaps it's not completely a coincidence that at the same time there's like no regulation of the financial sector, or financial sector regulation is very, very weak, and there's an incredibly strong and economically based regulation of the of firms' mergers and so forth, right? And I would argue that to a large extent that's because there's a huge sector of consultants who go out there and advise competition agencies on whether they should approve a merger or not. And because of that, they hire economists. And the economists they hire want to do a good job so they make money in that area. So they ask their colleagues to write papers that help them make arguments one way or another in a case. Whereas in finance, all the economists, all the money's to be made working for hedge funds. And the hedge funds want to be able to predict what happens to prices, and they hire economists to help them do that. And so economists want to get papers from their colleagues telling them about how to predict what happens to asset prices, right? And I think that if you look at different areas of economics and you ask who funds those areas and what do those economists do on the side, you can get a lot of insight into what people are writing papers about at any given time. So, okay. So that's economics writ large. Let me talk about some of the individual topics we'll be going through in this class. So on Thursday and next Tuesday, we're going to talk about firms. We'll start by talking about what are firms, what should they maximize, and what in practice do firms maximize, how do internal conflicts within firms interfere with them maximizing profits. We'll talk about supply curves over different time horizons and the interpretation of short-run and long-run supply curves in terms of durable and storable factors of production. And we'll use that to try to think about rich dynamic phenomenon in terms of static models over different runs of time. We'll then talk about industry supply and entry and how that's related to the duration in which a market exists, scarce talent, and the way that it acts as a barrier to entry as well as other barriers to entry. We'll then talk about talents and rents in a competitive market and the distribution of those under Zipf's law and other power laws. The next two lectures will cover equilibrium, and we'll start by talking about equilibrium existence and how that relates to large markets. We'll then talk about the correspondence principle, which has to do with uniqueness, stability, comparative statics. We'll then talk about income effects and the basis for our very common assumption that income effects are small, that people have quasi-linear utility. We'll then talk about incidence of taxation in a competitive market and how that relates to many other things, including to international trade. And we'll go through different theories of international trade. Then we'll talk about the design of systems for allocating courses to students in universities as sort of a leading application of the theory of markets, and about decentralized versus centralized ways of running a market for allocating courses. And we'll use that as a frame for thinking about whether the first fundamental welfare theorem is really as capitalist as you guys have learned that it is. And in fact, we'll talk about socialist interpretations of the first fundamental welfare theorem. And in particular, why those socialist interpretations are increasingly attractive in the face of the growth of information technology. Then we'll turn to the problem of externalities. And first, we'll talk about what an externality is, the distinction between real and pecuniary externalities. And I apologize to the people who took price theory last year because this is one of the lectures that overlaps between them. But it's adapted a little bit. We'll talk about internalities and some of the hard philosophical cases about what is or is not an externality. We'll then talk about alternative policy responses to externalities, such as taxes, cap and trade, and litigation. We'll then talk about the trade-off between prices and quantities as ways of controlling externalities, and Stigler's Coase theorem and the role of information. We'll then turn to how we actually assemble the information to have sensible externality policies, using both science and stuff about the value of human life, as well as ways of collecting information not from expert scientists, but from the public at large when they have the relevant information. And we'll talk about surveys to do that, but why surveys have strategic problems and the mechanisms that have been devised for getting people to actually truthfully reveal their information, but then the problems that exist with those mechanisms as well. Then we'll start to introduce market power by talking about monopolies. What is a monopoly? What are the sources of monopoly power? What are the distortions created by monopolies, and how do they optimally price? We'll then talk about the empirical measurement of monopoly pricing, and we'll relate that to the question of ironing, which is a technique for studying optimal monopoly pricing. We'll then talk about measurements of the monopoly distortion, as well as incidence under monopoly and how that compares to under perfect competition and places where that can be applied. Then we'll talk about problems with regulating a monopoly down to marginal cost and why average cost pricing is more often used, as well as some reasons why average cost pricing can arise even absent a regulatory context. We'll then talk about the distortions that are created by average cost pricing and its relationship to the problem of selection in insurance and other adverse selection markets. And then we'll talk about the relationship between that and the collapse of markets and look at some empirical analyses of insurance and what they tell us about optimal regulation of the insurance industry. Then we'll have the midterm. And when we come back from the midterm, we're going to move beyond those questions that we were just talking about, which are the distortions that a monopoly makes to the quantity that's produced. And instead, we'll talk about the distortions monopoly makes to the characteristics of the products. So we'll start by talking about why perfect price discrimination doesn't just solve the monopoly problem. And then we'll talk about considerations that monopolies have in terms of how they design and price their products, and apply that to Hotelling's model of competition on a line, and use that to think about both newspapers and political competition. Then we'll talk about what are called platforms, which are contexts in which the value of a product depends on who's actually using the product. We'll then give some applications of that to designing products in order to sort for the best consumers, and then use it as a way to understand product design, product pricing, in particular third degree, second degree price discrimination in the price discrimination area. Then we'll turn to thinking about what encourages firms to actually enter an industry in the first place and how monopoly profits are really that incentive. and how those dynamic effects of monopoly are actually much more important in a lot of ways than the static distortions that we'd been studying previously. We'll talk about creative destruction, crime, and the dynamic, and we'll relate that to the theory of crime. And we'll use that as a way to study Becker's theory of optimal criminal justice. And then we'll relate that to the theory of optimal intellectual property and derive optimal rules for intellectual property based on the trade-off between the static distortion from monopoly power and the dynamic incentive effects of monopoly. And we'll derive optimal innovation policies from that, as well as talking about alternatives to intellectual property as ways of rewarding innovation. OK. Then the next we'll turn to a case where there's not either perfect competition or monopoly when firms imperfectly compete with one another. We'll talk about different oligopoly solution concepts and how to summarize those with the idea of a conduct parameter. We'll talk about the empirical measurement of oligopoly as well as incidence in symmetric oligopoly. Then we'll talk about more interesting issues that come up with incidence in asymmetric oligopolies and some of the benefits that market power may actually have when there are selection distortions and what we'll call cream skimming distortions that have to do with changing the way that your product is designed to attract the most valuable customers. We'll then turn to the benefits of competition, which come out of Cournot's theory of competition, as well as other theories of competition. And we'll look at empirical studies of the effects of competition on prices. And those will provide a justification for having a competition policy. And we'll talk about how that works all over the world, as well as how you can quantify the effects of things like mergers on prices. Finally, we'll wrap up the course by talking about, I think, some of the most exciting sort of big picture public economics problems about policy. We'll begin by discussing the huge and growing problem of inequality around the world and talk about the classic arguments for the redistribution of wealth and derive from those the utilitarian framework for redistributing wealth, for quantifying the incentives to redistribute wealth. And we'll derive from that optimal income tax issues and formulas for optimal income taxes and the trade-offs that are involved in those. And then we'll calibrate those models with empirical data. We'll then talk about what are public goods and public bads and how the free rider problem endangers private provision of public goods. And from that, we'll derive the necessity of using coercive government power in order to provide public goods. But given that we're using coercive government power, the need for making collective decisions about how those goods are provided. And that will lead us into social choice theory. And social choice theory will lead us to think about different ways to make public decisions that are more or less efficient. And we'll talk about different approaches to voting and their strengths and weaknesses. And at the end, I'll give a plug for my own personal preferred solution, which is this idea of quadratic vote buying as an efficient way to make social decisions. And then finally, I'll wrap up the course. So that's all for today. I'll see you guys on Thursday, and I'll stay after to answer any questions you have.